Welcome back to our program, ladies and gentlemen. Appreciate you sticking with us here throughout the afternoon for this event. I think it's going to be a very dynamic conversation as we sort of, to borrow a racing turn, turn three into turn four, and really into that home stretch here in this dynamic conversation that we at AgriPulse are having with Elanco. For those that might not know me, my name is Spencer Chase. I am the managing editor of our Washington office for AgriPulse Communications. Great to be with you. Great to have play such a small part in such a big conversation, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what we can do to continue that dialogue here coming up. And so off we go. You may have noticed during that break, a poll question popped up, and would encourage you to participate, offer your thoughts in that poll question, sound off on what you think are some of those biggest barriers facing the industry as they look to achieve some of those big goals that we've been discussing here throughout the day. We'll have the opportunity to go over some of those discussions here and those poll results a little bit later on down the road. I'm going to transition now into another panel as we look at some of the other things that we're looking to discuss. We've talked a lot today about various things such as, some of the goals that the industry has, some of the things that the industry hopes to accomplish by that 2030, 2050 or thereabouts. But one of those things that will need to be done is, as we go through that process, there are going to need to be a number of things that will be overcome, some current obstacles sitting in front of the industry. And so I want to encourage the panelists for the upcoming discussion to join me here and join me here in the Zoom platform that we are using to just kind of engage in that discussion. And as they work to join me, I will just offer some brief introductions for the three of them. We've got a great dynamic panel, and really looking forward to hearing what they have to offer. I want to first mention Sarah Place, the Chief Sustainability Officer at Elanco. Also joining us is going to be Kim Stackhouse Lawson, the Director of Colorado State University's Sustainable Livestock Systems Collaborative. And last but certainly not least, we will have Jason Clay, the Senior Vice President Senior Vice President with the World Wildlife Fund, where he heads up their agriculture, aquaculture, and forestry efforts. And so really looking forward to the discussion and dialogue we're going to be having with this group. And Sarah, given the fact that you're with Elanco, I'm with AgriPulse and Elanco having this event, I'm going to pick on you first. As you look at some of the big, ambitious goals that the industry has in terms of not only production, but the environmental aspects that go along with that, what do you think are going to be some of the things that the industry is going to need most in its efforts to achieve those goals?
Yeah, thanks, Spencer. And thanks everybody for joining today. We really appreciate all the attendance, the interaction so far. I think we can bucket, our needs in a few different ways, right? And the first one is just, we've heard this several times already this afternoon, of we don't know where we're going if we don't know where we're at, right? We have to be able to measure some of these outcomes that we find important that are related to sustainability. Of course, the topic of the day is definitely climate, right? That seems to always rise to the top when we talk about sustainability. There's so many other important aspects there. And this dual challenge of it's the environment, but it's also about nutrition. And I think that's another thing, I'll answer your question, but almost just to bring that back to why this is so central and why we're talking so much about the things we can do on the supply side of animal source food production, because it's absolutely critical, right? We sometimes see this, I would say, a false choice put up that we can't improve enough, so therefore the industry must shrink. To be quite frank about it, that is some of the narrative that's coming out of the Food Systems Summit. And I think it's really important that the industry demonstrates that that is not the case, not just because we self-servingly want the industry to continue, but because it's absolutely critical for human nutritional adequacy to have animal source food in the food supply. And that's so true, of course, in the developing world, but it's also true in the developed world. And so I think we always need to really scrutinize these assumptions that are put forward that we are eating too much. I would say, really dig into those assumptions. I don't think that's necessarily the case. We can probably improve the quality of our diets, but not necessarily by pulling out nutrient-dense food. So measurement is key, whether we're talking about nutrition and having the good science on that front, or greenhouse gas emissions, right? But that also sets the building blocks for the other outcomes we need to move, right? We need to have good measurement to actually be able to facilitate the adoption of new innovations, right? If we have innovations that potentially can reduce emissions, for example, specifically, we're going to need that feedback loop of being able to measure it and being able to drive further innovations in directionally correct ways. And I think the third piece, and Jeff mentioned this right at the top, right? The reality is that we need the economic driver behind those two things, right? To get that positive feedback loop working and create that flywheel that drives that positive change across the industry, across all species, really around the world. So those are the really key things of the nuts and bolts of how do we get there. We need action in those three areas. We need good ways to measure realistically. We need the ability to have the good innovation, right? And that feedback loop, again, with the economic drivers between those aspects.
Jason, I want to bring you into the conversation here as we talk about, and Sarah so eloquently stated some of the need for the various measurement protocols that we'll have here. One of the things that I'm always curious about when we're having conversations like this is measurement to what end? We have this data. What do we end up doing with it? Your thoughts on that front in terms of some of the gaps between where we are now and where some of these various industries hope to go as it relates to what will be done with some of the data and some of the additional information that will be gathered between now and then?
I think we're in a place where we don't actually yet have common metrics, and so we're not talking the same way about the same things. The boundaries aren't always the same. Even things like LCAs are not done the same. There is some work being done because as soon as we get to apples comparison, then we're on firm ground. Right now, it's a little bit all over the place. So I think that's the first thing. But I think you can't manage, much less improve performance if you don't know what it is. It's very simple. If you give 1,000 protein producers the same practice, you'll get 1,000 results. If you tell them what result you want, then you'll get innovation. So, going forward, we actually need much more innovation than we need compliance. And so we really want people to be learning, because whatever's good enough today won't be tomorrow. And it'll be what we're trying to get rid of the day after that. So I think we're using the metrics to try to improve performance, but to also then be able to talk about it, explain it, and show others, so that it's not just a one-off thing on a single farm or a single property. I think it's that process of sharing that's also going to let us learn more. Sharing through platforms, either of like producers like dairy or eggs or poultry or fish or whatever, but also across all proteins. They have feed in common, they have manure in common. They don't all have enteric fermentation, but there are lots of things where they can be working on many of these issues and learn from each other and actually adapt, because there isn't a blueprint here. It's, even if you're in dairy, what Mike's doing is not going to fit your farm. You can even have the same number of cows and it's not going to fit the farm. But I think that that's really where we're coming from on this is to improve environmental performance, and increasingly it's got to be about social performance as well, and farmer income. It can't just be about the environmental or the carbon side of all this, the greenhouse gas emissions.
Very good. And Kim, lastly, I'd like to bring you into the conversation here as well. Wondering from that faculty perspective, if you could put your educator hat on for us for a second here, looking at obviously some of the people that will be engaging in some of those innovations. As much as some of us might not like to admit it, they might be in high school right now. They might be in college or even middle school. What do you think is needed in terms of educational opportunities within that talent, within that industry talent pipeline to help the Elencos of the world get to that goal of achieving that climate change mitigation?
Yeah, thanks, Spencer, and thanks for having me. I think it's twofold. I think we heard this a number of times from other presenters. First, that the research really needs to be actionable and it has to have impact. Second, that there's absolutely zero funding coming from government agencies to address these monumental concerns that are quite frankly shaping the future of this industry. So what I would say is that there is no incentive for any university right now to add any faculty that is dedicated to this initiative, nor is there any incentive to train the next generation of innovators focused on sustainable animal agriculture, specifically related even to climate change. So, I think that we need to make that point very well known, right? And we heard that time and time again, that it comes from it comes from the private industry. Well, the risk mitigation on the private industry side, that's carried by the public sector. Right. That is really the questions that researchers do are, 99% of my job is to fail. Right. I ask those questions, and it should be that 99% of the questions I ask as a scientist fail. And 99% of the students that I'm training, their questions fail too. Right? Because those are the innovators that Elanco wants to hire. That's who WWF wants on their team. That's who eventually you want to go interview, right? Are those people that aren't afraid to fail, that they're willing to push the boundaries of what we know is possible. And until there's that pull through, right, that market incentive that's going to come to any university, those innovators aren't going to be here, Spencer. And that is something that should keep us all up at night, because this is a huge task. And I'm not sure where we're going to get the manpower to really execute.
So in the earlier part of that response, sorry, go ahead, Jason.
Yeah, I think that point about failing and being prepared to fail is important, but I also think that sharing of information allows us to fail better. We learn from other people's mistakes. The thing I always tell my staff, feel free to make a mistake. I want you making mistakes. Never make a mistake somebody else has already made. That's the way we learn. So get informed and then really move forward. And I don't see the willingness to share a lot of information right now in the sector. And so if we're creating these goals of 50% reduction by 2050, that means people have to learn a lot faster. They have to share a lot more, especially about what fails.
Mm-hmm.
That's right, Jason. And I think there's an interesting question between, is it really pre-competitive or is there a competitive notion to this, right? And that is something that I think it is worth a lot of conversation, and probably not something we have time for, Spencer, but it is an interesting notion of sort of where is that kind of pull through from the market going to come.
Mm-hmm. Kim, you had mentioned in your response that there just really isn't much of that incentive to hire the kind of faculty to do the kind of education that really needs to be done. In your mind, what's it going to take to create that incentive? What's needed out there?
Well, just like Mike said earlier in the panel, we need USDA to step up and be willing to fund this sort of work. I think there's a misnomer, right, that our public institutions are predominantly funded by taxpayer dollars. They're not anymore, right? Our job is to go out and win grants and to conduct that research. And certainly, we're also, of course, on a model of students and their tuition dollars. But there are fundamental kind of, programmatic type classes that those students are going to get predominantly in their undergrad. You're going to see this kind of advanced training happen in master's and PhD programs. And at that point, that student shifts to soft funds, right? And the research that they are going to do and the opportunities for them to learn these sorts of topic areas, that's going to be coming from for the most part, federal grants.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to just remind the audience, as you're sitting here and watching this discussion, would encourage you to engage in it through the question and answer function at the bottom of your Zoom window, through the chat function. The panelists did offer in a preparatory call for this discussion that in the event we aren't able to get to some of these questions that might be submitted, they did offer to respond to any questions that we can't get to here within a week of this discussion. So anything that is on your mind, feel free to submit, and we'll get to as many as many of your audience questions as we can. But Sarah, I want to bring you back into the fold here, because we were talking with Kim a little bit there about some of the things that are needed to systematically help out at the university level. So let's say everything goes gangbusters and all those issues get fixed. What kind of research do you want them to do? As a representative of a private sector company here, where do you foresee the research gaps?
Yeah, so I think we've heard some of this earlier, right, of where those research gaps are, and quite frankly, some of them that would be of interest of a private company aren't all the ones that a public institution should do. And I think that's what Kim highlighted very well, is that these are public square challenges. So the public square should step up and fund the research to get those done. But when we think about this of helping our customers solve these challenges, and again, if we take a narrow focus and we just look at this issue of climate change, we know we got areas that we need to improve on. And one, if we focus on ruminants across the world, we know enteric methane is a big challenge, right? So back to Jason's point, if we focus on the outcome is we want to reduce total methane emissions coming from the global ruminant herd, all cattle, buffalo, sheep, goats that are out there on the landscape. How do we get there, and what are the different innovations that can help us, right? So we heard some of those things mentioned earlier. Genetics, for example, is a great opportunity, but that's an excellent example of we need a lot of data if we're going to move this thing with genetics. Thousands of animals have to be phenotyped, meaning thousands of animals are going to have their methane emissions measured, and we have limited capacity at our research institutions currently to do that. So that's one of those practical examples of that feedback loop of we need to have the research capacity in terms of the physical infrastructure, but also the human beings to do it, and the investment in both of those things to actually execute on it. That would be a great example, right? So every other way that we can influence enteric methane, we would need those innovations. And the cross-cutting issue that Jason mentioned that goes across all of our species, we think about feed production. A great example of we have a couple animal scientists on this panel, but we need folks from outside of animal sciences as well, right? We need folks that understand soils and that can really help us quantify, what is the potential to move productivity and potentially carbon storage of soils in the same direction, right? What is possible? It's one of those things. I know we get questions over and over again, and folks would think, hey, in the year 2021, we should be able to actually know this answer relatively easily, but we do not, right? So that's another huge gap where understanding what is the potential of different management systems based on prior management, based on soils and climate, to actually move the needle, right? So those are two big areas that I think, it makes a whole lot of sense to have those public-private partnerships to really drive the industry forward. And that's something that's relevant here in the US. It's relevant anywhere else in the world. It's relevant for aquaculture as it is relevant for cattle production.
I think to pick up on that feed issue, we've been working with different sectors about where the ingredients are sourced for the feeds that they buy. These are not companies that are making their own feed. And what we're finding out is that it's very hard for them to get that information. Feed companies consider it proprietary. And yet, if we're trying to really reduce emissions, we have to not only know where it was produced, but how it was produced. And when it was produced, because it's all going to vary. If it came from the Amazon, it's going to be different than if it came from Iowa, et cetera. And the producer has a right to know that kind of information, yet it's not made available. That on the feed side is rather deliberate, because they're substituting materials all the time to try to get the lowest cost formulations. And they don't want to necessarily be tied into just the ones that they can name ahead of time to give that information. But we've got the same issue with traders, where they don't want to necessarily say where the grain is coming from, and they don't necessarily want to spend money on the system to keep it, to figure out how to know where it comes from and how it was produced. These are common issues that we need to put some resources into, because we're not going to be able to measure the reductions of these credibly if we don't know where and how the feed ingredients were produced.
And Spencer, just to add to this, to make sure that we're really being fair as a panel, I think all of us would agree that it's as important to focus on greenhouse gas mitigation as it's as important to focus on climate adaptation, right? So we know the climate has shifted, and in some parts of certainly the United States, when you think about the Southeast, that's been an extreme drought for more than 15 years now. That's not a short-term drought. That is, in fact, what climate scientists are saying, their new climate. And so I think there needs to be as much of a focus on how do we adapt these systems? How do we make sure that there's resiliency in the system? There's a note in the chat about social scientists. How do we lean on those social scientists and help inform our scientific decisions to make sure that those adaptive strategies are meaningful to our producers, that they're practical to implement, that we're talking about them and learning from them, all in this same tone, because right now it's not a, do this and we'll see that. Right now it's a we need this and because we are in my opinion very much teetering right now on sort of where are we going to get this resiliency? Where is this global food security going to come from, and how do we really balance this dual challenge in a really meaningful, thoughtful, and proactive way that maintains these really important not only agriculture but social systems right through this globe.
Mm-hmm. And I want to sit and maybe zoom out a little bit here in terms of, we're talking a lot about what we need to make happen, and some of the metrics that might be needed to gauge that. But once those metrics are measured, I guess my question for anyone in particular who would like to take it is, what does progress necessarily look like in this case? Are we looking at total GHG reductions from the animal agriculture system? Are we looking at average per head? What are some of those benchmarks that the industry is going to need to be shooting toward in its process to achieve some of these goals?
So I think if we were to narrowly just look at, again, climate and nutrition, right? There are so many goals out there that are about net zero or climate neutrality. And I know we almost don't have enough time to get into the specifics of that, right? But ultimately, a lot of it is looking at the grand challenge that we have, that we all share, right? From a standpoint of climate change, and saying we need to stop warming the planet, right? We need to stop disrupting the climate, because I think the point that Kim just brought up is, we sometimes don't talk about that enough. Of the whole point of our worry about climate change is because it makes our life on Earth harder, right? Including feeding ourselves, which is the main thing that's going to get disrupted by climate change. So ultimately, that's the key goal, is how do we get to a point where we cease this industry contributing to warming, and get to a point that hopefully we can actually do our part to even draw down and get back to a more pre-industrial revolution, or is definitely pre-1970s, before we started dumping so much CO2 into the atmosphere situation, right? So I think that standpoint, we're pretty clear on what the outcome needs to be. But that is substantial. And I don't want to downplay, I think that poll earlier, right? A lot of folks answered it. It's hard, it's possible, right? And it is very hard, especially when we think about the reductions that are going to be required, because darn near all the emissions that we're talking about are actually from microbes, right? Whether they're microbes in the soil, or microbes in the animal's gut, or microbes in the animal's manure. And it's not as easy as, say, a tailpipe, where you have a simple way to measure it, a simple way to control it. So we're trying to interact with living processes and try to reduce those emissions, right? But I think it's possible, right? We have the technical feasibility. And I think the main thing is all these goals and commitments is sending a signal to companies like Elanco that we got to get busy making solutions that are practical, that are implementable for folks to make that movement happen. And I'll just come back to the nutrition side. I think it's so important, again, that we need to emphasize, we call it animal protein, but it is more than protein, right? It's high quality protein. It's all the essential nutrients in the bioavailable form for folks, and especially critical nutrients that are lacking in developing countries, but even developed countries. I mean, we have a disturbingly high number of premenopausal women, even in the United States, that do not have nutritional adequacy. And not getting enough iron, for example, right? So we can't have a solution, a quote unquote solution to these issues that is, well, just reduce the amount that we're producing. That's not actually a solution if it's creating more nutritional inadequacy problems, right? And so I think that's what's really key, and why it's so important for animal agriculture to continue to step up because it really is about that dual challenge, right? We have to do our part on the climate front, and we have to do our part for human nutrition and for adequacy of nutrient supply in our food supply.
I think we have to be talking about absolute reductions. We can't even entertain relative, per ton of product. That's just not going to get us anywhere. But I think we have to do this, and we really need to acknowledge this, which I don't think has been yet today in this group. We need to do this within a global environment where we may be losing 10 to 15% of primary net productivity already just because of climate change, on forests, on fisheries, on soil, whether they're being farmed or not. So it's making our job much harder to actually do these things, to produce more with even fewer. And so this gets back to what Sarah was saying. Yes, but it's going to be pretty hard. And I think the science is only going to make it harder as it gets better.
Well, and another question I'll ask, and I'll direct it to you, Kim, as well. At a certain point, the packers, the producers, the various folks in the supply chain here got to make money to be able to afford to implement some of these changes that will get us from point A to point B here. What needs to be done to make some of these sustainability efforts, some of these climate change and mitigation efforts practical and affordable on the ground level?
Yeah, so that was what I was going to add to your measurement question, Spencer. So wonderful question to follow that up. I think there has to be other win-wins that come with these strategies, right? So we've got to get either wins on the performance side, we've got to get wins on another value side. So if it's an improvement in ammonia and greenhouse gas emissions, or an improvement in water quality, or a reduction in water use, right? Something else that provides that sort of win-win, and in which there's a value that is directly kind of pulled from that producer's pocket so they can pay for it. Or there's which I think this group has pushed back a little bit on consumption the entire day, or there's more of a pull through from that consumer in, right, that says, hey, I feel better about this product, I'm going to buy more of it because it emotionally I feel like it's the right thing to do. But that you're right. When we're only focused on climate and nutrition, all of us, I see now there's still nearly 300 people on the call. All of us, I'm sure, are sustainability minded. So very much, thinking about this from a social and economic and an environmental lens. And we know that's a huge challenge, and we know it's the only way that this works. And so I think when we think about research and product and technology that is focused on driving impact, part of that impact, yeah, you betcha, has to be on climate, but part of it's got to be these other wins, right? We have to have a win-win strategy, or we won't see uptake and adoption unless there's value driven from that. And I'm the first to say value is it can be more than just a dollar. It can be, right? Value can exist in more than just a dollar format. That's the easiest, of course. But we have to think about that value to the supply chain and to the producers that are in our supply chains.
The slaughterhouses, back to the very first part of that question, they need to make money, but they also need to know where the animals are coming from that they're buying. And they don't right now know where indirects come from because we don't track and trace. And that's something that we're actually experimenting with in Argentina, of all places. But if you don't track and trace animals, how do you really think about addressing zoonotic diseases? Because we know there are going to be more of them. We know swine flu is just one issue, but we've had 2 or 3 diseases for the last 100 years, per year. So some of these costs are just overdue. They just have to be part of what a well-functioning, resilient system does. Is that what the government pays for? Probably. Those are some of the kinds of things that need to happen at that level. Is that what trade should maybe require? Perhaps.
Very good. Well, I want to turn now to a question submitted through the Q&A function. Again, would encourage all of you, if a question pops up in your mind that you'd like to address to the panelists, by all means, let us know. Kim, I'm going to pick on you first with this one, but would invite Sarah and Jason's thoughts on it as well. A questioner asks about the role of food animal veterinarians in sustainability and points out that trends show a lack of vets in the pipeline, and it's a kind of a career choice that involves a decent amount of debts to get into. So, Kim, your thoughts?
Yeah, so appreciate the knowledge of the person submitting the question. It is a career choice that involves a lot of debt, and one that does not pay very well either in rural communities. And I think that that's something that the animal agriculture industry has struggled with for quite some time. As part of our initiative here at Colorado State, we're building a new center dedicated to sustainability, and we're going to hire 13 tenured faculty to address solutions for sustainable animal agriculture. Half of those faculty positions will be in the College of Veterinary Medicine, focused on population health, working on really trying to understand that nexus between animal health and sustainability. I think it's really interesting. My postdoc and I were talking about this the other day. How fascinating is it that no one has, there's been a few white papers written, but no one has really looked at something like even as simple as parasite control. I think we're constantly focused on what's that silver bullet for methane mitigation, because it is, right? I mean, we've talked about it so many times today. Enteric emissions, it's what my PhD is, and it's really fascinating. We get to work with microbes. It's complex, very exciting. But what are some of the lower hanging fruit where there's huge opportunity? And I know Jason talked about this on our prep call, but that the lower end kind of that bell curve and the way that animals are raised, right? There's the average. And if we could just move that bottom end up just slightly, not even just slightly, to average, right? Which is a lot, but in the scheme of the bell curve, it's not that much. What kind of improvements could we make? And whereby I think Jason's point around, absolute emissions would stay the same, but the amount of meat that we would produce would go up, because these animals would be improved from a health status. And so these could be things as simple as parasite control, proper vaccinations, mineral and vitamin supplement. And, we really haven't put our shoulder in this stuff yet, Spencer. We've been focused on enteric emissions. We've been focused, and we've been focused on nitrous oxide, but there's just not enough of us kind of working in this space to begin to really answer some of those questions. How important are these food animal veterinarians? I would say in these rural communities, probably more important now than they have ever been, if we are really going to solve the climate crisis and continue to feed the world. So that's going to be something that we are going to have to continue to address and wrestle and help communities get better at. We hosted a learning session for communities to help them say, how might you attract rural veterinarians or food animal veterinarians to your rural community? Those are hard questions, right? It's as hard to get them to go to vet school and take on the debt as it is to, why don't you move to the middle of nowhere and make almost no money and, do really hard work? And so this is going to be kind of, I think, a full court press to answer some of those big questions as well. Great question.
And Kim, a question came in as you were offering that response in the chat, wondering what there is in terms of potential for measurement of some of those simpler actions that you mentioned, things like parasite control and proper vaccination. What quantification ability do we have on that at this point?
Yeah, so I think Sarah addressed some of that. Jason did too when we started the conversation. And the answer is it's frustrating because we use models and we all use different models. So we do back to original point number one, need to get to some sort of similar metric that everyone can agree on. And there is work in that space, but it's still got some work to go. So first, we can model that kind of impact. I'm really interested in studying those animals actually on a green feed and seeing what happens to the nutrient retention. Spencer, we're doing some work here we've got a team here that has basically revolutionized methane measurement from oil and gas. And I've been working with them to try to get better at measuring both ammonia and methane emissions in pasture from the individual animal with lasers. It's very hard to do, but some of what I think needs to happen in the research space is that we need to get better at measuring these emissions so that we can detect it. So if we give somebody a parasite control, right, we know they're going to grow faster. We actually know that nutrients should be retained in that animal better too, right? We should actually be able to see it in the air. And so I think we could get to the point where we get better at that as scientists. And so that we can say we have models, but we also have another way to measure these things. And that I think is really important. That gives confidence, right, to these measurement systems and confidence to the progress that we're making. And more importantly, confidence to the practices that we might be encouraging producers to adopt, right? Or potentially supply chains may be mandating. And I think that's a very real thing that might come, right, for these producers to adopt.
Very good. I want to turn to another question. I'm going to direct it to Sarah, but again, would open it up to the rest of the panelists as well. And Sarah, this question points to the role of food waste and loss, especially as it relates to animal agriculture and the impact that has on sustainability and environmental outcomes. Wondering, the questioner is, what strategy should animal agriculture industries develop to deal with that challenge of food waste and loss?
Yeah, so that's a great question because it's intuitive. We know that we produce a lot of food. We put a lot of effort into producing food that never actually nourishes anyone, right? So that's something that we always identify as a low-hanging fruit of what can we do to minimize those losses where possible. Or when we do have losses or waste, what can we do with all those nutrients rather than just put them in a landfill, for example, because that's the least desirable outcome for those nutrients when we've gone through all that work of it. So I think there's a lot of different ways to think about this. And honestly, it's kind of related to the points that Kim was just bringing up about disease, right? Because you can think about disease and animal losses in the supply chain as, quite frankly, that's food loss as well, right? I mean, ultimately, to be a scientist about this, but it's all about the first law of thermodynamics, right? And the conservation of mass, what we have going into the system and what we're getting out of it. And the question of when we do have losses, how can we cycle those nutrients back around in useful ways? So first and foremost, I would just say this is actually one of those key places where animal agriculture is incredibly important, right? Fundamentally, why we've domesticated livestock across the board is because they take plants that we either don't want to eat or can't eat and make higher value products from them, right? And oftentimes that will include things that are waste products from crop agriculture, whether it's all the other parts of the plant that we cannot consume, everything from straw to peelings to hulls, all sorts of different aspects of plants, or in some cases, things that are potentially food grade but don't make the cut, right? That end up back into farm animal feed, right? Obviously, there's always issues with that and making sure from a food safety standpoint that we're following the right protocols there when we do recycle or upcycle those type of products, right? But I think that's a key aspect of it. And the rest of it, quite frankly, all the rest to the consumer is more about supply chain logistics, cold chain, integrity and everything else, right, to avoid those losses there. But I think that's really an intuitive question. Again, we know there's a tremendous amount of waste. Up to a third of edible food in the U.S. gets wasted. It's roughly about the same if we look at loss and waste together globally, right? So a huge opportunity for us to address this dual challenge of reducing climate impacts and improving nutritional adequacy in some cases if we can reduce that issue.
Jason, one of the things that we discussed as we were getting ready for this panel was sort of some of the conversation around the, obviously the goal of the industry is to achieve neutral production, that climate neutral production, but there's some climate impacts that have already happened and basically can't be undone. What role do you think that's going to play in some of the production and educational systems that we're going to need to see here going forward? Specifically as we look at agriculture.
Well, I think it depends a little bit on how you want to define the things that can't be undone. As I look at, I wrote a book about 20 or so ag commodities. And what I found was that producers all over the world could retire anywhere from 2 to 30% of their land and produce more on what was left and have biodiversity, have better water quality, have less soil erosion. They reduced their costs. They had higher net incomes. Why don't we do that? I mean, that's what the CRP program actually did in the US at a much bigger scale, took 8% of land out of production over 40 years. Production tripled on the 92% of land. Soil erosion was cut in half for the whole country. I mean, these are things that we need to look at, but now when you bring carbon into the mix, farmers can actually grow and sequester carbon in those areas. They can bring back biodiversity. There's other things that those areas are good for that may not be farming. And so they could still be part of a very viable strategy, not just marginal land anymore. I think we're going to see the rehabilitation of a lot of land. But some of the areas are never going to go back to what they were. They're not going to be tropical forests. They're not going to be even temperate forests. But they can have the ability to still provide environmental services. And I think that's what we should be looking for. And that's what farmers and other landowners could actually be contributing to over time. We've been talking about, farmers, but there are a lot of other landowners around that could also be tapping into some of these markets or generating revenues and important environmental services.
So, folks, we've got about 10 or 12 minutes here left in our conversation. Again, would encourage you, if you're looking for some engagement with this panel, please let us know via the Q&A or chat function. But I pick you all up and I sit you down in the room with the UN officials that are trying to figure out some of these tough questions here next week. Jason, I'll start with you. What's your message to the United Nations folks, especially as it relates to the production capacity and the climate change mitigation capacity of animal agriculture?
One message or
yeah, your message, pitch. I suppose. It's well, we are a little limited on time.
Yeah. So I think that we're not only going to have to produce more because of more people and because of increased consumption. We're going to have to do it with deteriorating conditions. Where we're already losing genetic gains, for example, of a lot of crops like corn and soybeans. Their genetic gains are going down from what was predicted. So we have that, to me, says we really do have to reduce food waste by half. That's the easiest way to keep some kind of levelness about this. We've also, quite frankly, got to start looking at population as an issue. We can't just say it's all about consumption, which I've been saying for a long time, because it is about consumption. But every person that's born is a consumer, and then suddenly you have a whole different thing. So we've got to get a handle around that. I don't think we can have a planet with 10 billion people with anywhere near the lives that any of us at this point have lived. It just doesn't quite work that way.
Kim, your thoughts on what you'd like to share with the UN leaders?
Yeah, I think inviting animal agriculture to the table, but also listening to the journey. These producers have innovated for generations, and it's remarkable. And they've innovated for generations across the globe. I think, Jason talked a little bit about collaborative networks that should be established kind of in the research and more technical community. But I think, the potential to connect those collaborative kind of social networks, even amongst livestock producers, is something that the UN could actually help facilitate. And I think some of the hesitancy there is that it might just be the developed countries talking to the less developed countries or the underdeveloped countries. But in fact, I think some of the developed countries could learn a lot from developing countries and herders. And as our climate changes, resilience kind of adaptations to following weather and following climate, and kind of this concept of, really strong kind of social herding networks that work together to attack great challenges is something that the UN could actually facilitate and could really have incredible positive change, especially for our ruminant systems across the globe. And I think sometimes, Spencer, when livestock is attacked or animal agriculture is attacked, right? Our nature is to say, hey, we're not that bad. Look at all these wonderful things that we do. And I think that we still have incredible opportunities to learn and to grow also, but we need to be included in those sorts of great challenges and those discussions so that our industry can kind of live up to that, to the challenge and also its opportunity. And I hope that the UN is willing to hear from us in that space.
Sarah, I'll have you back clean up on this one. Your thoughts on what you'd like, what you would share with the UN given the opportunity.
Yeah, I think some great comments made. And I think indeed the beauty of that forum is the ability to bring people together from across the world, right, and across production systems. I think the points that Kim just brought up of there are different ways to learn here, and there's so many different production systems, right? There are folks that are pastoralists that have been clearly demonstrating that livestock agriculture can be sustainable because they've been doing things in some way, shape, or form similarly for thousands of years. So obviously it's sustainable, right? So there are those aspects of it, which I think are great to bring together that forum of shared learning. But then I think the key thing that we hear here is that you had to have actual adequate investment in this from a standpoint of people, from a standpoint of scientific advancement that actually meets the moment. And I think that's what's lacking. It's just there's a lot of talking like we're doing right now. There's lots of talking, and we need to move to a point of concrete action. And that's going to require adequate investment. And I think the key thing there is to highlight the investment may seem like a lot, but it's not that much in the grand scheme of the issues that we're addressing, which is truly about the success of the future of humanity on planet Earth. That's a rather important issue, right? So it requires investment, and how we feed ourselves and how we manage landscapes is a huge intersection with livestock agriculture. And so, we should have that level of dedication to solving this issue. And I think, unfortunately, we often get into these contentious debates about viewing animal agriculture negatively, and that shuts down really important conversations, right? And the ability to make those advancements. So really, we have a crunch period of the next 40, 50 years where human population growth will peak because human population rate of growth has declined since the 60s. I think we can do it. More people is a challenge, but more people is more brains, right? More people is more human capacity. So I'm bullish on our ability to solve this. We just have to actually invest in it, and that we will be able to do it, right? Hopefully put those big brains fueled by animal source foods to the test and actually achieve those outcomes.
Well, obviously, if we all had the ability to prejudge and know exactly what the UN was going to say in the next week, maybe we'd use those skills to instead go buy a lottery ticket. But obviously, a lot of things to keep an eye on here from this industry and from these folks in particular. We do have just a few minutes left, so I am going to tee it up here for all of the panelists here. 60 seconds, if you could offer any closing comments and any closing thoughts that you'd like to leave with your fellow panelists and with the audience. And Sarah, I'll start with you on this one.
Yeah, thanks, Spencer. And I'd just like to say thank you again to our fellow panelists for taking the time, and everybody for attending today. We really appreciate it. And I think the main thing is we just hope that this is the beginning of a continued dialogue, but also on that track of action, right? To kind of pick up where we just left off. I think everyone recognizes this is a fundamental issue, that it's just about doing the right thing, but it's also really central to animal agriculture across the world, across species, again, a shared issue. So I think the key thing is for us to, stew on these ideas that we've covered today, but also think about how do we move towards moving the needle on each one of these areas that we've identified? How do we get better at management and measurement, right? How do we get better at incentivizing those innovations, and hopefully coming up with ways to incentivize the feedback loops of driving those things further down the line? Because we do have to cut total emissions from the industry and simultaneously increase output. That's a gargantuan task. I think we can do it, but it is going to take all these great minds, folks that are gathered here today, to keep moving forward on that.
Thanks, Sarah. Jason, your final thoughts?
Well, I've been struck all day by some research that we did a few years ago, looking at the range of proteins and what their impacts were and what the nutritional values were from plant to animal, et cetera. And I asked the group at the start of the research if they would, spend that part of that 2 years looking at, is there ever a time in human history where diet has shifted in a major category by 20% anywhere in the world? Nobody could find anything. So I think in some ways, like it or not, livestock's here to stay. That doesn't give livestock a pass. It actually puts more responsibility on them, because now they've actually got to show that they can make these changes, and that a lot more can be done. And I think that's going to be the real challenge. But I think working together, we can actually make these things happen. We just have to work together much more than we ever have.
Very good. Appreciate that. And Kim, your thoughts?
Yeah, just to reiterate, I think, and we're all sort of saying the same things a bit, but, we've got to really be focused on driving that impact and that change, and really the pushing the boundaries of what we know is possible. And when we say what we know is possible, but what we know is possible from a research perspective, what we know is possible from a practice adoption perspective, what we know is possible from a collaborative perspective, what we know is possible from a funding perspective. Sarah's right. We've got to resource this if we're really going to drive this big change and develop these solutions. But I think all of that is possible. And, I think if COVID taught us nothing, it's that we can come together and beat really massive, really big challenges. And no, those challenges are not all answered today. And we need to begin moving yesterday. So faster is better. So thank you, Elanco, for hosting the wonderful event.
Well, Kim and Jason and Sarah, appreciate the dialogue, appreciate the thoughts, a great discussion on a great number of issues. So thank you for taking the time to join us here today.